Hello, I'm Daniel Simpson, and I'm the creator of this course on the roots of modern yoga, and I'm really excited about it. There has been so much research in the last 20 years or so on this subject, exploring really how an ancient Indian practice of renouncing the world became a globalized industry based on the practice of postures for the most part. Something that we don't find if we start rewinding to the oldest Indian texts that talk about yoga. Instead, we see different things. So the aim of this course is to show, first of all, how things have changed considerably over the centuries, and yet at the same time to trace some of the threads of continuity. Because yoga, although it has been in a process of almost continuous evolution, has maintained some consistent themes over the centuries. And part of the aim of this course is to highlight both things at once. Yoga is often about holding opposites together in a expansive sort of perspective that can contain both of them. So although there is effort made in yoga practice, there's also a bit of letting go. And although there is an enormous amount of transformation in the history of yoga, there are some of these threads that enable us today still to maintain some kind of a connection to the past. And the aim of the course really is to illustrate some of the themes that have driven that process of change, while at the same time, obviously, therefore, identifying how those themes relate back to what we find in earlier traditions of yoga. And that's really one of the first things I suppose we should emphasize. There are many traditions of yoga. This course can't explore all of them. What we will do, though, is zero in on the evolution of a practice aimed at those who live in society, have families, have jobs, have regular householder commitments, and promoting different objectives to those we find discussed in the earliest texts, health and well-being. And these in themselves are evolutions of yoga's original objective of transcending suffering and the causes of suffering. So I think you can see in examples such as that sort of pulling in two ways process, the sort of duality that's contained within a bigger wholeness of transforming one's relationship with reality. So we're not going to explore everything about yoga, that's the first thing. We can't possibly explore the entire history of yoga. What we're going to do is, over the course of 7 sessions, trace a progression from the earliest days to what we find today and what we stand on the cusp of in modern yoga and looking forwards into an uncertain future. And part of the process of looking forwards is to understand how some of those threads from the past might still be brought in to what yoga is becoming in the present moment. So just to clarify, this course, I guess, from my perspective, and I'm biased, I wrote it, but I think it offers a comprehensive overview of pretty much everything a yoga teacher needs to know about the history of yoga. But it's not only designed for yoga teachers. I am a yoga teacher and practitioner myself. I've also got scholarly training in exploring the history and evolution of traditions of yoga. And so I'm trying to marry the two perspectives, the scholarly analysis of what's going on, but I'm always trying to bring it back to the practitioner perspective of, why do I need to know this? Why is this relevant? And so the result of all of this is hopefully a course that is, on the one hand, engaging, full of fascinating detail, accessible, conveyed in plain English, trying to pare down too much of the scholarly detail, because we can get lost in that rather than being able to fly above it and see the bigger picture. And then I guess at the same time it is grounded in scholarly rigour. So we've got a lot of new information that's emerged, and hopefully this will help you to understand how all of that fits together. So we start with the very first session, going back in time, rewinding to the very beginning of yoga, just to see how different things are. The earliest descriptions of yoga are basically world-renouncing. They turn away from life as we know it, shutting things down. You might be familiar with Patanjali's definition of yoga as the stilling of the mind. There's also a stilling of the body, and in a way the body is the problem in the earliest descriptions of yoga. So we need to, I think, understand first of all where that comes from, and then as we move into the second session, how perspectives on that started to change, how the idea of the body became, I guess, transformed in and of itself through the influence of tantric philosophy, which is largely about transforming the body in various ways as a preparation for ritual, but also really as an understanding of interactions with the world potentially being a way to resolve the fundamental problems of yoga, or problems of life that yoga resolves, let's put it more clearly. The ways in which we get entangled in suffering. And now instead of turning away from the world, the tantric religions offer the perspective of turning towards the world while still trying to be skillful in one's engagement with it. So the body became a potential vehicle, and physical yoga traditions grew out of that in the last 1,000 years. Basically doing something other than sitting still is relatively recent. Connecting sequences of postures that are non-seated is a lot more recent, and we'll come to that towards the fourth session. But in between, I think we need to look in the third session of the course at the philosophical context for yoga, because that in itself is a complicated process of combining lots of different influences, and that is what goes on throughout the history of yoga. So we'll look philosophically at how some of the distinctions between different systems get blurred, and how in some ways that enables the evolution of different practices. And also in the modern era there are examples of this. We will look at how really in the late 19th century combinations of ancient Indian ideas, the latest Western perspectives became intertwined, both in India and in the West. And so modern yoga really evolves out of that. So it's helpful to see that philosophical backdrop before we move on to the fascinating question of where do a large number of the postures that are commonly practiced today actually come from. Because we don't find quite a few of the most, I guess, familiar in ancient texts. And I'm thinking here of sun salutations, and particularly some of the standing postures, the wide-legged ones like the triangle pose, the warrior pose, staples of the average modern postural yoga class, but not to be found in sources before the 20th century. So what do we make of that? Well, there's a lot to be said, and I can't say it all here, but suffice to say that is perhaps the most fascinating fulcrum of the course. So that's where we are in the middle of it, really building up to looking at where does modern physical practice develop in India in more than 100 years ago, but the refining of it takes place as a globalized process. So we'll see how that works through some of the most influential teachers in the presentation of modern postural yoga, particularly Krishnamacharya and his students B.K.S. Iyengar, K. Pattabhi Jois. So we'll look at those systems of yoga from a perspective, again, that's aligned with people who practice. We're not trying to say anybody's practice is in some way inauthentic because it's been developed more recently. We're trying in some ways actually to unpack the question of authenticity throughout the course. Things don't have to be old to be useful, and the question of what makes them authentic has got a lot more to do with how they're approached. So we'll look at that towards the end of the course. But before we get there, there's a couple of other key themes that we need to address. One, the development not only of new methods, but new objectives, and really yoga for health and well-being is also something that developed in early 20th century India, certainly as a widespread phenomenon, and obviously in the modern globalized yoga scene, that's why people come to classes. So as I mentioned, the beginning of the course will explore where the original practices of yoga came from and how that was largely a world-renouncing perspective. This session will bring to life how science, how new understandings of I guess the functioning of the body shifted the ways in which yoga was presented but also taught and framed in texts, the ways it was instructed. So a lot of the ideas related to yoga therapy emerged in that process as well. So we'll look at particularly influential teachers in the development of these new approaches, such as Swami Kuvalayananda and Sri Yogendra, both of whom had the same teacher, and really systematized the idea of yoga as a therapeutic method. And the other, and perhaps most striking distinction between early systems of yoga and what we find today is the prevalence of women. We just don't see that many references to women in ancient yoga texts, and yet go to a modern yoga class and it's predominantly female. So we need to account for that process of change, and really there's a lot we can say about I guess the slow evolution of the gender balance shifting, because there are some characters who appear in texts who are female right back to the earliest Upanishads, even before yoga is defined, but they're not very numerous. And so we'll look at some of the reasons why, and then we'll also look at what accelerated the involvement of women and how women's involvement in the development of modern approaches to yoga practice has in itself been transformative and influenced the way that modern yoga is presented. So that will be one of the perhaps most, I guess, relevant modules to the way people are talking these days about yoga in the modern world, and trying to understand questions of equity, diversity, inclusion. And that leads us on to the final module, where there are other issues to address, particularly the question of who owns yoga as it goes off into the world of industrial capitalism. And there are all sorts of things that we'll touch on there to I guess, illustrate both the reasons for current concerns with questions of cultural appropriation and decolonization, but also noting how complex these issues are, and how at the same time there is a process whereby politicians take advantage of the popularity of yoga and of these themes, perhaps to push their own agendas. So we'll unpack that and see ultimately really what it means to be an authentic yoga practitioner in the 21st century. And to sum it up, it's not simple to sum up. And I think that's really a question that we'll go away from the course reflecting on, because it's really one for everybody to consider for themselves. But the course will nonetheless point to some themes, to some trends, to some ideas that might be helpful to reflect on as part of that process. So I hope you're now, having heard a little bit more about it, as excited as I am. I'm looking forward to getting started. So look forward to seeing you there.